The night Helen Langford left, she did not slam the door. She did not weep. She did not beg. She simply placed one letter on Joseph Hawthorne's mahogany desk, smoothed the edge with her fingertip, and walked away from 5 years of invisible heartbreak. One sentence. That was all she wrote. I no longer wait for you. Joseph read it the next morning and laughed, actually laughed, because he was certain she would be back by supper. He had never been more wrong about anything in his entire life. If you've ever loved someone who never truly saw you, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? The servants at Hawthorne Estate had a name for the sound that came from Lady Helen's private sitting room late at night. They called it the quiet, not silence. Silence was the absence of sound. This was something else entirely. This was the quiet of a woman who had run out of things to say to walls, to empty chairs, to a husband who was always somewhere else. It pressed through the floorboards and settled into the downstairs hallway like a draft that never left, no matter how many fires burned in the hearths. Mrs. Calloway, the head housekeeper, had worked at Hawthorne Estate for 23 years. She had served Joseph's father, helped raise Joseph himself, and been present the day Joseph brought Helen home as his new bride in the spring of 1813. She remembered that day clearly. Helen in pale yellow silk, laughing at something a stable boy said, reaching down to touch a wildflower growing through the courtyard stone. Curious. Alive. Warm as August. 5 years later. Helen Langford Hawthorne moved through the same corridors like a woman who had learned to take up less space. She still dressed well. She still spoke graciously to every servant by name, still asked after their families, still left small gifts on their birthdays. She had not become cold. That was the tragedy of it. She had not become cold at all. She had simply become quiet in a way that broke Mrs. Calloway's heart every single morning. The breakfast table told the story better than words ever could. 2 place settings every day, perfectly arranged. Fresh flowers from the garden. Helen always cut them herself before 7 in the morning. 2 cups, 2 plates, silverware polished to a mirror shine. And every morning Joseph's seat sat empty. His coffee grew cold. His toast went untouched. A footman would eventually clear his place while Helen sat with a book open in front of her. Turning pages she wasn't reading. Listening for footsteps she knew weren't coming. She never said anything about it. That was what haunted Mrs. Calloway the most. She never complained. Never sent word upstairs that breakfast was ready. Never asked the footman where Lord Hawthorne had gone or when he might return. She simply absorbed the emptiness with the practiced stillness of a woman who had been absorbing it for years. Joseph Hawthorne was not a cruel man. Mrs. Calloway would say that to her grave because it was true, and truth mattered more than easy stories. He was not cruel. He was not cold-blooded. He did not take pleasure in his wife's loneliness. He simply, and this was the word that Mrs. Calloway turned over in her mind on dark nights, he simply never thought about it. He was a man of tremendous capability and almost no interior vision. He managed 4 estates across the Virginia territories and 2 more inherited properties near the Carolina border. He sat on 3 commercial boards, corresponded weekly with legal advisors in Philadelphia, and maintained relationships with every powerful family within 2 counties. He could quote land yield figures from memory, negotiate a contract in his sleep, and read a man's financial intention from the first handshake. But he could not read the woman who sat across from him at dinner every night. Could not or did not bother to try. There was a difference Helen had come to understand. A meaningful, devastating difference. She had tried in the early years. Lord, she had tried with everything she had. She had learned his schedule and arranged her days around it, hoping to catch him in the corridor between meetings. She had read the books on his study shelves so she could speak to him about things that interested him. She had attended every social gathering. He hosted, stood at his side, smiled when he introduced her, and swallowed the particular sting of watching his eyes move past her to the next man whose hand he needed to shake. She had written him letters during a particularly long business trip to Richmond in 1815. 12 letters in 3 weeks, full of the small things she thought he might want to know. What the gardens looked like after the late frost. How the foal born to his favorite mare had his father's white markings. what she had been thinking about at night when she couldn't sleep. He wrote back once, 2 lines about his return date and a reminder about a dinner engagement she needed to prepare for. She kept all 12 of her letters. She kept his 2-line reply as well, though she was never quite sure why. Evidence, perhaps. Not for a court of law, but for her self-proof that she had actually tried, that the loneliness was not invented, that she had reached and reached and reached and come back empty-handed every single time. By 1817 she had stopped reaching. Not with bitterness. She examined herself carefully for bitterness and found to her own surprise very little of it. What she found instead was something quieter and more frightening, a slow, steady settling. Like a fire that had burned down, not because anyone put it out, but simply because it had exhausted its own fuel. She stopped waiting at the sitting room window when he traveled. She stopped arranging her evenings around the possibility that he might come home early and want company. She stopped asking Mrs. Calloway whether Lord Hawthorne had mentioned anything about dinner plans. She stopped hoping in the small specific ways that nobody noticed, and the stopping was so gradual that nobody, including Joseph, ever saw it happen. The letter came after the dinner. The blue dress dinner, Mrs. Calloway called it afterward, though Helen herself had no name for it at the time. It was a Tuesday in November 1818. Helen had arranged a private dinner for 2, not a social occasion, not a formal event. Just the 2 of them in the small dining room off the east wing that caught the last of the afternoon light. She had asked Cook to prepare his favorites: roast pheasant, the potato dish with herbs he'd once mentioned enjoying at his cousin's table, the apple tart he had eaten 2 helpings of at Christmas 5 years ago, the first Christmas of their marriage, when she had still believed things would become easier once they found their rhythm. She dressed carefully. The blue gown had been a calculated choice. He had touched the fabric once early in their marriage and said something offhand about how blue suited her. She had remembered. She had always remembered everything. She lit the candles herself. She sat at the table at 7 o'clock. At 8, she asked a footman to check whether Lord Hawthorne was still in his study. The footman returned with the information that Lord Hawthorne had departed for the Greaves estate 2 hours prior for an unexpected meeting regarding the autumn land survey, and had sent no word. Helen thanked the footman by name. She asked him to pass her compliments to the kitchen. Then she sat alone at the candlelit table and ate her dinner in complete silence. And when she was finished, she folded her napkin with the same precision she brought to everything, pushed back her chair, and went upstairs. She did not cry. She had moved past the crying some time ago, somewhere between the 12 letters and the 2-line reply, and she could not quite remember the last time. Tears had felt like they were still a possibility. She sat at her writing desk for a long time. The candle burned low. Outside, the Virginia night was cold and clear, the kind of night that made the stars look close enough to touch. She pulled a piece of paper toward her, dipped her pen. "I no longer wait for you." She read it back, folded it, walked down the corridor to his study, placed it on the center of his desk where he could not possibly miss it, and returned to bed. She slept better than she had in months. Joseph found the letter at 6 in the morning, still in his evening coat, his boots loud on the floorboards. He'd ridden back from the Greaves estate in the early dark, mildly satisfied with how the survey negotiation had gone, thinking vaguely that he should have sent word about dinner, but that Helen would understand. She always understood. She was remarkably sensible that way. It was one of the things he appreciated about her. He picked up the folded paper. "Read it. Read it again. I no longer wait for you." He turned it over, looking for more. There was no more. One sentence in her careful, even hand, and that was everything she had left him. His first reaction, and he would be ashamed of this later, deeply, irreparably ashamed, was mild irritation. He set the letter down, poured himself water from the carafe on the side table, decided she was tired, perhaps. The household management could be taxing, he knew, and women were given to moods, particularly in the autumn months. He'd read something about it somewhere, the change in weather affecting temperament. She would be herself again by morning. By the following morning, certainly. He went to bed. She was gone before he woke up. Not dramatically gone. Not vanished in the night gone. She had arranged everything with her characteristic precision. A note to Mrs. Calloway, outlining the household schedule through the end of the month, instructions for the kitchen, a reminder about the quarterly linen inventory. She had taken 3 trunks and her personal maid Abigail, and she had departed in the family's smaller carriage for the Langford country property, 40 miles south, the one that had come to her through her own family's holdings, the one that technically bore her name, not his. When Joseph came downstairs to breakfast and found her chair empty and Mrs. Calloway standing stiffly by the sideboard, with an expression he had never seen on the woman's face before, something between sorrow and judgment, the irritation curdled into something else. "Where is Lady Hawthorne?" "Her ladyship has gone to Langford, sir." Mrs. Calloway's voice was perfectly correct. Her eyes were not. He waited for more. She offered nothing more. "When does she return?" "She did not indicate, sir." Joseph sat down at the table. His coffee was hot. His plate was arranged exactly as it always was. The flowers in the center vase were fresh. Helen must have cut them before she left. Even then, even on the morning of her departure, she had cut the flowers. He stared at them for a long moment. "She'll be back," he said. To himself mostly. To the flowers, perhaps. Mrs. Calloway said nothing. But she did not agree, and they both knew it. The first weeks, Joseph told himself it was a rest. Helen had been fatigued. The estate demanded a great deal of its mistress, and he had perhaps not been as attentive as he might have been. He could acknowledge that he was not unreasonable, and a period of quiet at the country property was no doubt exactly what she needed. He sent a brief letter expressing his hope that the change of air was agreeable. He mentioned that the Hargreaves were planning a winter gathering, and that her presence would naturally be expected. She wrote back in a week. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. She thanked him for his note. She provided a detailed accounting of the condition of the Langford property's eastern drainage, which appeared to have suffered during the autumn rains. She indicated she was in correspondence with a surveyor about the matter. She mentioned that the household accounts were in order, and she would forward a full report at month's end. She said nothing about the Hargreaves gathering. She said nothing about returning. She said nothing, and this was what finally began working its way under his skin about missing him. He read the letter 3 times, looking for a line he'd missed. There wasn't one. He wrote back asking directly when she intended to come home. She responded in 10 days, and he read her reply, standing at his study window, with the particular sensation of a man who has asked a simple question and received an answer that has somehow made everything more complicated. "I am home, Joseph. I appreciate your inquiry. The drainage survey has been completed. I have engaged Mr. Ferris to manage the repair work beginning next month. Please give my regards to the Hargreaves." He put the letter down. He poured himself a drink at 10 in the morning, which was not something he did. Something was wrong. Something was different. He couldn't put his finger on it precisely, and the inability to name it irritated him in a way that the situation itself hadn't quite managed. He wrote to his brother. Edward Hawthorne arrived at the estate on a Wednesday, unannounced, as he always arrived everywhere because he had found that announced arrivals gave people time to rehearse, and he was profoundly uninterested in rehearsed people. How was 4 years Joseph's junior, and had always been the brother who noticed things. Where Joseph saw land yields and social obligations, Edward saw faces. He saw the way people held their shoulders when they were protecting something. He saw hesitation before smiles and the specific quality of laughter that came from genuine amusement versus polite performance. He walked into his brother's study, dropped into the best chair without being invited, stretched his long legs toward the fire and said, "You look terrible. Thank you for coming. I came because your letter was alarming, though not in the way you probably intended." Edward studied him. "You wrote 3 pages about Helen's departure and managed to make it sound almost entirely like an administrative problem. It is in part an administrative problem. The Hargreaves gathering. Joseph. 1 word. Quiet. Firm as a closed door." Joseph stopped. "Tell me what actually happened." So Joseph told him. He told it the way he understood it. A wife who had seemed perhaps somewhat withdrawn in recent months. A missed dinner that had been unavoidable, given the circumstances of the Greaves survey, a letter that seemed disproportionate in its response to a single evening's absence. A departure that he could only describe as theatrical. "Did you know she had prepared dinner for you that night?" Joseph paused. She often has dinner prepared. Not like this, apparently. Edward had spoken with Mrs. Calloway before coming upstairs. He usually did when visiting. He liked Mrs. Calloway, who had never in his memory told a single comfortable lie. She arranged the small dining room. Your favorites, all of them. The dress she wore, do you know, the blue dress? Something stirred in Joseph's memory. Pale blue fabric. An early evening years ago, a compliment he'd made without quite thinking about it. She remembered that, Edward said. She remembered something you said years ago, and she dressed for you on a night you weren't there. The fire crackled. Outside November wind worked at the windows. She's done this before, Edward continued. Not the dinner precisely, but the trying. You're aware of that, aren't you? That she's been trying for a very long time. She never said anything. Joseph. Edward leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at his brother with the patient expression of a man explaining arithmetic to someone who should have learned it years ago. She wrote you 12 letters from Langford when you were in Richmond in 1815. I know this because she mentioned it to Charlotte last spring, and Charlotte mentioned it to me. 12 letters. What did you write back? Silence. I was occupied. The Richmond dealings were complicated. There were 3 separate. What did you write back? 1 letter, perhaps 2. 1 letter, 2 lines. Edward sat back. And the flowers, Joseph? On your breakfast table every morning, even the morning she left. Did you notice them? Did you ever once in 5 years mention them? I hadn't. He knew it the moment Edward said it. He hadn't noticed. Not really, they were simply there, the way the silver was simply there and the fire was simply there. Part of the machinery of a well-run household. Not something a person had done with her own hands before 7 in the morning, because she wanted the table to look beautiful even if nobody said so. She did not leave because she stopped loving you. Edward's voice was quieter now. Not unkind. Something worse than unkind, accurate. You understand that, don't you? This wasn't a fit of temper. This wasn't a mood. This was a woman who spent years trying to belong to her own marriage and finally concluded that the effort was hers alone. She should have told me. She did tell you. Not in words you were listening for, but she told you every day in every way she knew how. Edward straightened his coat. The question now isn't what Helen did or didn't do. The question is what you're going to do. He moved toward the door, then stopped. I should mention I intend to visit Langford next week. Charlotte wants to call on Helen. I'll observe what I see and report honestly since you won't be there to see it yourself. And if I came with you? Edward turned, looked at him for a long moment. Then you'd best prepare yourself, he said. Because from what Mrs. Calloway tells me, the woman you left is not the woman you'll find there. She was not the woman he had left. That much Edward confirmed when he returned from Langford, dropping into the same chair in Joseph's study, with an expression that was harder to read than usual. She's well, Edward said. It sounded almost like a warning. Of course she's well. She's at a country estate with... I don't mean comfortable well. I mean genuinely well. He paused, choosing his words carefully, which was unusual enough that it made Joseph straighten in his chair. She's managing the property herself, not with an agent herself. She's in correspondence with the farmers, she's overseen the drainage repairs, she's established some arrangement with the village schoolmaster. The tenants speak of her by name Joseph, not as Lady Hawthorne, by her name. Joseph said nothing. She laughed 3 times in one morning while we were there. Not the kind of laughing a woman does at a social gathering when something must be acknowledged. The other kind. Edward looked at him steadily. She looked healthier than I've seen her in 3 years. She looked like herself. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. He stood. And it means that whatever you decide to do next, you'd better be very certain of your reasons. Because a woman who has found her footing does not need you to come and disrupt it out of loneliness or pride or the administrative inconvenience of an absent wife. He left without saying goodbye, which meant he was more troubled than he was showing, and Joseph knew his brother well enough to understand that. He sat in his study long after the fire burned low. The house was quiet around him. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. He had never noticed before Helen left that there was a difference. He noticed it now. He noticed it at breakfast when the flowers appeared on the table. Mrs. Calloway had kept the tradition, or perhaps the undergardener had simply continued without instruction. But either way, they appeared each morning, and now he stared at them. He noticed it in the evenings when he walked past the small east dining room, and the table was set for one, and the room was perfectly correct and entirely without warmth. He noticed it when he went to his study to work late into the night and found himself pausing listening for something that never came. Her footstep in the corridor. Her voice in the distance speaking to one of the maids. The small sounds of a life being lived alongside his own. He hadn't realized how full the house had been of her until she was gone. He hadn't realized because he hadn't been paying attention, and the recognition of that, the specific knowledge that he had lived alongside something irreplaceable and failed to understand its value until the moment it was absent, sat on his chest like a stone in the November dark. He went to his writing desk, pulled out paper. He wrote 4 different letters that night, tore each one. The first was practical, almost businesslike, too much, like every response he'd ever given her, and he could see it now, could see exactly why she had stopped expecting anything else from him. The second tried for sentiment and landed on performance. The third was honest but frightened in a way that felt unfair to send to a woman who had earned her peace. The fourth. He pushed the fourth aside, unfinished. He did not know yet how to say what he needed to say. He had spent 40 years in a world that rewarded precision and decisiveness and the management of complications. He did not have language for this. He did not have language for the fact that he had read his wife's absence like a business document. Inconvenient, temporary, requiring a practical response, and missed entirely. That what she had placed on his desk was not a problem to be solved, but a door closing on everything he had failed to see. He found the drawer that night going through the study, looking for something else, something mundane. A property deed. Perhaps he couldn't remember afterward what he'd been looking for, because the moment he opened the third drawer down on the left side of his father's old mahogany desk, he stopped looking for anything else. Letters. A small stack of them folded and tied with plain white ribbon. Helen's handwriting on the outside of each, his name in her careful hand, and beneath his name in smaller letters, the dates. 1815. All of them from 1815. The Richmond trip. He sat down slowly. He picked up the first one, opened it with the particular care of a man handling something that has suddenly revealed itself to be fragile. She had described the garden, the late frost, and how it had caught the early roses. She had described the foal born to the gray mare. She'd named it Copper. She wrote because of the color it went in certain light. She wrote about a book she'd been reading, a history of the early settlements, and a passage that had made her think of something her mother had said years ago. She wrote about missing him. Not dramatically, not the kind of missing that demanded a response or made him responsible for the size of her longing. Just plainly. I find myself wondering what you would make of this evening. The light on the fields right now is remarkable. I wish you were here to see it. He read all 12 letters. It took most of the night. When he set the last one down, it was nearly 4 in the morning. The study was cold, the fire long dead. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. He found the sentence near the end of the 11th letter, and it went through him like a blade through still water. I don't need him to love me in the way I once hoped. I only wish he had seen me, really seen me before I stopped trying. I think that is the thing I will carry longest. Not the loneliness. The not being seen. He sat with that for a very long time. Dawn was beginning to gray the windows when he finally stood straightened and made a decision. He was going to Langford. He did not know what he would say. He did not know if she would hear him. He did not know if he was being honest with himself in the thin gray light of a November morning, whether he deserved to be heard. But he had spent 40 years being certain of outcomes before he moved, and look where his certainty had left him alone in a cold study at 4 in the morning, reading letters his wife had written him 3 years ago, and never sent, finally understanding every single word. Certainty had cost him enough. He would go without it. He would go, and he would stand in front of the woman who had cut flowers for his breakfast table on the morning she left him, and he would genuinely try for the first time to say something true. Outside, the Virginia morning was coming up cold and clear. A long ride south. 40 miles of November road between himself and everything he had almost thrown away. He rang for his valet. He was leaving at first light. The road to Langford was 40 miles of hard Virginia ground, and Joseph Hawthorne rode every inch of it without stopping. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had ridden out at first light with nothing but his coat, and the particular desperation of a man who has finally understood something he cannot ununderstand, and the urgency of that knowledge sat in his chest the entire way, making him press the horse faster than was sensible on frozen roads. His valet had tried to pack a trunk. Joseph had waved it off. His steward had mentioned 3 appointments requiring attention before the week's end. Joseph had walked past him mid-sentence. For the first time in 20 years of managing estates, courts, contracts, and the 1,000 small tyrannies of responsibility, Joseph Hawthorne left everything unattended and rode south. He arrived at Langford property just past noon. What he found stopped him before he even reached the gate. Helen was standing in the yard outside the main house, speaking to a man Joseph didn't recognize, older, sun-worn, the kind of hands that came from decades of working land rather than managing it from behind a desk. A farmer, clearly. He held his hat in both hands and was nodding with the specific deference of a man who respects whoever he is talking to, not merely one who fears them. Helen was pointing toward the eastern field. She was wearing a practical dark dress, not mourning clothes, not the elaborate arrangements of Hawthorne Estate. Something sensible and unadorned, and her hair was pulled back simply, and she was gesturing and talking, and the farmer was listening with his entire body turned toward her. She was laughing at something he said. Not the careful, socially calibrated laugh Joseph had heard across 100 dinner tables. The other kind. The kind Edward had described. The kind that came from a woman who had stopped performing and started living. Joseph pulled up his horse at the gate and sat there for a moment, watching, and the stone in his chest got heavier. The farmer noticed him first. His eyes went to the gate, then back to Helen. She turned. The laugher stopped. Not because she was unhappy to see him. Because she was surprised, genuinely deeply surprised, in a way that told him she had not expected this. She had expected perhaps another letter. Another 2 lines. Not him here in the flesh on a frozen December morning, having ridden through the night. They looked at each other across the yard. The farmer excused himself with quiet tact, replacing his hat and moving off toward the eastern field with the particular discretion of a man who recognizes a moment that doesn't belong to him. Helen did not move toward Joseph. She did not move away. She simply stood where she was and waited, and there was something in the quality of that waiting that was entirely different from every waiting she had ever done at Hawthorne Estate. She was not waiting with hope. She was not waiting with longing. She was waiting with the settled patience of a woman who has decided that she will not go to meet something that should come to her. Joseph dismounted. He handed his horse to a stable hand who appeared from the side yard. He walked across the frozen ground toward his wife, and with every step, he was aware that he had absolutely no idea what he was going to say. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to speak normally, far enough to give her room. Helen, Joseph. Her voice was the same low, clear voice he had heard across 5 years of dinners and parlors and corridors. But there was something different in it. Something had been removed. The particular tension of a woman who is always slightly braced for disappointment, that was gone. She sounded, he realized, relaxed. In a way she had not sounded in years. Perhaps ever. You look well. It was a terrible opening, and he knew it the moment it came out of his mouth. The generic pleasantry of a man who has run out of social script and grabbed the first available line. Something moved in her eyes. Not cruelty, just recognition. You look tired, she replied. Did you ride through the night? Most of it. Why? And there it was. One word, direct and clean, and it cut through every prepared phrase he'd been constructing during 40 miles of frozen road and left him standing in front of her with nothing but the truth. Because I read your letters. The shift in her face was slight, but he saw it. Her chin lifted a fraction. Her hands, which had been easy at her sides, stilled. Which letters? The ones from Richmond, the ones in the drawer. He held her gaze. All 12 of them, last night, from beginning to end. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Too heavy to be uncomfortable, it had moved past that into something else. "I didn't know you kept them," she said finally. "I didn't know I had them. I didn't know they existed." He said it flatly, because that was the flattest, truest version of his own failure. "I never opened the drawer." She looked at him steadily, and he watched her process that. The acknowledgement that he had held those letters unread in his own desk for 3 years. She did not flinch. She did not reach for anger. She only absorbed it quietly the way she had absorbed 1,000 things before it. "Come inside," she said at last. "You need something warm." It was not forgiveness. He understood that immediately. It was hospitality, the deeply ingrained reflex of a woman raised to extend courtesy, regardless of her private feelings. But he would take it. He would take anything she gave, and not mistake it for more. The kitchen at Langford was smaller than any room at Hawthorne Estate, and warmer. Helen directed him to a chair near the stove, with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to being useful, and a young kitchen maid he'd never seen before brought coffee without being asked. Which meant Helen had built something here, a household that anticipated her, that moved with her rhythms rather than waiting to be told. He wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the cold leaving his fingers slowly. Helen sat across from him at the kitchen table. Not in a parlor. Not at a formal arrangement of chairs that would have put correct distance between them. The kitchen table with flowers still on one corner and a list of figures written on a small paper near the window and the sounds of the house working around them. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him. "Why did you really come, Joseph? And I want the honest answer, not the prepared one." "How do you know I have a prepared one?" "Because I know you. Simple, not sharp, just true. You always have a prepared answer. You've been crafting something during the entire ride, I expect." He exhaled, put the coffee down, made himself look directly at her. "I came because I sat in my study last night reading words you wrote 3 years ago, and I understood for the first time, actually understood what I had been doing to you. Not what I had done once, not a single mistake I could point to and correct. What I had been doing, continuously, for years." Her expression didn't change. She was listening in the way she had always listened, completely quietly, without interruption. He had taken that quality for granted for 5 years. He saw it now for what it was, a gift and a discipline, and something that had cost her. "I thought providing for the estate was providing for you," he continued. "I thought because nothing was lacking in the material sense, there was nothing lacking. I thought—" He stopped, pressed on. "I thought your contentment was settled, that it required nothing further from me." "You thought I was a matter that had been handled," Helen said. "Yes." It landed hard, as it deserved to. "That's exactly right. And I was wrong. And I don't say that the way a man says it when he wants the argument to end. I say it because I sat alone in that house last night and understood in a way I cannot ununderstand what it cost you to finally stop trying." Something moved across her face. A flicker, quick, controlled, but there. "The 11th letter," he said. "Near the end. I only wish he had seen me before I stopped trying. I read that sentence at 4 in the morning, and I have not stopped thinking about it since." Helen looked away, out the small window. Her jaw worked once. "I remember writing that," she said quietly. "I know you do, and I know it was true. And I know that I don't have the right to come here and ask you to feel anything about that except what you feel." He leaned forward slightly. "But I need you to know that I see it now. What I missed. Who you were, who you are while I was looking directly past you." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove spoke. Outside, a distant sound of workers' voices, the ordinary machinery of a property being tended. "Do you know what I did last week?" Helen asked. She turned back from the window. Her voice was composed again. "I settled a 3-year dispute between 2 tenant families over a field boundary. I sat with them, both of them separately, and then together, and I found a solution that both families could accept. The estate agent said it couldn't be done without a magistrate. I did it in one afternoon." Joseph said nothing. He listened. "The week before that, I established a reading arrangement with the village schoolmaster. 3 mornings a week the tenant children can attend. I arranged the materials, and I arranged the funding, and I arranged the parents' consent, because 2 of them were skeptical, and I went to each of them personally." She held his gaze. "I have not been idle, Joseph." "I know. I have not been pining. I have not been sitting in this house waiting for you to realize you missed me. I know that too. Do you?" She said it without heat, with something closer to genuine curiosity. "Because I think the Joseph Hawthorne who rode 40 miles in the night is perhaps expecting to find his wife unhappy enough to want to come home. And I want you to understand clearly that I am not unhappy." The sentence dropped into the space between them and stayed there. Joseph absorbed it. Let it be what it was. A woman telling him the truth without softening it for his comfort. The most honest thing she had ever said to his face, probably because she'd spent 5 years softening everything. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it in the specific painful way of a man who knows that someone else's happiness has been built in the wreckage of his neglect. Helen studied him. Her eyes moved over his face with the careful attention of someone assessing sincerity. She had learned over years to distinguish between the two. "What do you want, Joseph?" "To earn back what I threw away." "You can't earn back time." "No." He didn't flinch from it. "I can't. I know that. I'm not asking for time back. I'm asking—" He stopped, found the words which were harder than any contract language he had ever assembled. "I'm asking whether you would allow me to try to become someone different than the man who ignored you for 5 years. Not for what it gives me, for what you deserve." Helen was quiet for a long time. Outside a voice called from the direction of the eastern field. One of the workers asking a question. Helen turned her head and called back an answer, specific, informed, immediate, and turned back without apparent interruption. That small moment, the ease of it, the absolute lack of performance. Joseph watched it and felt something shift in him. Not dissolve. Too much genuine change was required for a single moment in a kitchen to dissolve anything. But shift. "You won't understand what you've asked," Helen said finally. Her voice was measured. "You believe you've come here and spoken honestly, and you have, I'll grant you that. But you don't yet understand what it means to actually see another person. You've spent 40 years in a world where the people around you managed everything, so you never had to notice. Your staff, your stewards, your tenants, and me." She tilted her head slightly. "Noticing is a skill. You don't have it. You would have to learn it." "I know. And you are accustomed to being proficient at things, to coming to a task and doing it well. This is not that kind of task." "Helen, I'm not finished." She said it gently but completely, and he stopped. "I am not the woman who waited at a window for 5 years. That woman is gone. If you come back into my life in any form, you come into the life I have built. Not the one that used to be arranged around your schedule and your comfort and your preferences." She held his eyes. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He did. He understood it with uncomfortable precision. She was telling him that the terms had changed, that she would not reorganize herself around him again. That whatever happened between them from this point forward would happen on equal ground, or it would not happen at all. "Yes," he said. "I understand. I'm not certain you do, not yet." She rose from the table, not dismissively, but with the practical grace of a woman who manages her time because her time is genuinely full. "But I'll tell you what I will do, because I believe you rode 40 miles in the cold, and I believe for what it's worth that you mean what you've said this morning." She paused. "Stay. 2 days. Not as Lord Hawthorne come to retrieve his wife. As a person who needs to see what I've built here. Walk the property with me. Sit with the farmers. Come to the school arrangement tomorrow morning and sit in the back and watch." She looked at him steadily. "And then tell me at the end of 2 days whether you still believe you understand what you're asking for." It was not a welcome back. It was not a forgiveness. It was something rarer and more difficult. It was a test administered by a woman who had stopped needing to pass tests herself. Joseph Hawthorne nodded once. "I'll stay." The first morning he shadowed her. There was no better word for it. She moved through the day with a purpose and direction that left him genuinely surprised, not because he had thought her incapable, but because he now realized, has never once considered what she was capable of. She had existed at Hawthorne Estate as a presence. gracious, organized, reliable. He had not asked what she was underneath it. He followed her to the eastern field first, where the drainage repair was entering its final phase. The foreman, a weathered man named Carrick, greeted her by name and launched immediately into a detailed accounting of where they'd hit unexpected ground compaction and how he proposed to address it. Helen listened, asked two questions that clearly impressed Carrick by their technical specificity. She had been reading about land drainage, apparently had sent for a survey text from a printer in Richmond, and made a decision about the remediation approach in the time it would have taken Joseph to locate his estate agent. Then to the tenants. 3 families in the morning visiting over tea and plain talk, and Joseph sat slightly behind and to the side and watched his wife conduct herself with the specific fluency of someone who had earned trust through time and consistency. The farmers spoke to her differently than they spoke to him. Not with the deference of a tenant to a landlord, with the ease of a neighbor. They asked after her health. They told her things without being prompted. An elderly woman named Margaret pressed a jar of preserves into her hands, and Helen accepted it without the social theater of polite protest, which told him that this kind of exchange was normal, was repeated, was real. He observed it all and said almost nothing. There was nothing to say. What he was watching required no commentary, it only required witnessing. At midday, a rider arrived with letters from the Hawthorne estate steward, requiring Joseph's attention. He looked at them, recognized the signature, and handed them to his own man with instructions to send back that all decisions could wait until Friday. Helen noticed. She didn't comment. But he saw her notice. In the afternoon, she took him to the school arrangement. A single room attached to the church hall, a mix of tenant children who might otherwise have had no formal instruction. The schoolmaster was a young man named Tilsley, serious and earnest, and he introduced Helen to the parents with genuine warmth. Lady Langford arranged all of this, Tilsley said to Joseph, apparently unaware of or uninterested in his title, which Joseph found oddly refreshing. She argued the case to the church council herself. 3 meetings. They declined twice before agreeing. 3 meetings, Joseph repeated. He looked at Helen. The second decline was the closest, she said, with the brisk tone of someone describing a business negotiation. Reverend Cobb was the pivotal vote. I brought him the literacy statistics from the Philadelphia survey. Numbers matter to Reverend Cobb. You researched statistics for a village school meeting. I wanted to win the argument. Tilsley laughed. The parents nearby laughed. Helen smiled at something one of the children said, without seeming to notice that Joseph was staring at her. I was staring because he was trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the woman who had sat alone at a candlelit table in a blue dress, waiting for footsteps that never came. They were the same woman. He understood that intellectually. But the distance between those 2 images was a measure of everything he had failed to cultivate. And standing in a church hall in Langford, with that knowledge full in his chest, was perhaps the least comfortable he had been since the morning he first read that single sentence on his desk. I no longer wait for you. He had thought it was a complaint. He understood now that it was a declaration of independence. That evening, Helen's neighbor called a widow named Mrs. Pryor, perhaps 60 sharp as flint, who came for dinner with the ease of someone who had been coming for dinner for weeks. She sized Joseph up in the doorway, with the unhurried assessment of a woman who owes nobody courtesy she hasn't decided to extend voluntarily. So you came, Mrs. Pryor said. I did. Helen didn't think you would. Margaret, Helen said in a tone that suggested this was not the direction she had planned the evening to take. It's accurate. Mrs. Pryor stepped inside and handed her coat to Abigail without looking away from Joseph. She said when she arrived here 6 weeks ago that you would send a letter asking when she planned to return. Maybe 2 letters. She did not believe you would come yourself. She was nearly right, Joseph said. Mrs. Pryor studied him, decided something. She said and moved to the table. The dinner was unlike any meal Joseph had ever shared with his wife. Mrs. Pryor held opinions on everything. Land management, the territorial disputes to the west, a novel she had read last month, the inadequacy of the postal service in rural Virginia, and she stated them without modification for social comfort, and Helen argued back with equal directness, and the 2 of them created between them a conversation that was alive in a way that the dinners at Hawthorne Estate had never been. He watched his wife be brilliant. That was the only word he had for it sitting there. She was brilliant, not in the showy sense, not performing intelligence for approval, but in the natural sense, the sense of a mind that engaged with the world genuinely and was genuinely engaged by it. She made a point about the drainage economics that made Mrs. Pryor bark with laughter and slap the table. She gently corrected a date in something Mrs. Pryor was recounting with the particular assurance of someone who had looked it up and knew she was right. Joseph contributed where he could. He was not a stupid man. He knew his own competence, but he was aware that he was at this table on provisional terms as an observer more than a participant, and he respected that. He listened. He asked questions rather than making statements. He did not attempt to redirect the conversation toward his own areas of expertise. At one point, Mrs. Pryor turned to him directly and said, "Your wife tells me you manage 4 estates. 4 estates and 2 secondary properties, yes. And in 5 years of marriage, you never once visited this one." Absolute silence fell over the table. Abigail clearing dishes in the background became very still. "No," Joseph said. "I didn't." "Why?" "Because I didn't think it needed my attention." He held the old woman's gaze. "Because I didn't think she needed my attention. I was wrong on both counts." Mrs. Pryor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Helen. Something passed between the two women that he couldn't quite read, assessment perhaps, or the specific private language of women who have confided in each other. Well, Mrs. Pryor said, "at least you know it." It was not absolution. It was the narrowest possible acknowledgement that he was beginning in the right direction. Coming from a woman who had clearly been a fierce partisan of Helen's independence since her arrival, it was more than he had expected. He took it. The second morning came cold and gray, and Joseph was up before dawn. He had not slept well. The small guest room was unfamiliar. The sounds of Langford different from Hawthorne, and more than either of those things, his mind refused to quiet itself. He went downstairs and found the kitchen already occupied. Helen was at the table with the account books. Candle-lit, pen in hand, figures running down the margin of a page, entirely absorbed. She did not hear him on the stairs, and she did not look up when he entered, and for a full minute he stood in the doorway watching her work. Her face, unobserved, was something he had never seen. She frowned at a figure, scratched something out, made a small sound of satisfaction when she found what she was looking for. She tapped the pen against her lower lip while she thought. She was completely present in what she was doing, not performing competence, not demonstrating anything to anyone, just working, just being herself in an empty kitchen at 5 in the morning with ink on her fingers and candle wax on the corner of the page. He had missed 5 years of this. 5 years of the person she was when nobody was watching because he had never thought to watch. He must have made some sound because she looked up. There was a beat 1 second of something unguarded in her face before the composure settled back. Surprise, maybe, or something older than surprise. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He moved into the kitchen, pulled out the chair across from her. "May I?" She gestured with her pen. Went back to the accounts. He sat and watched her work for a while and didn't speak because he had learned in the last 2 days that silence around Helen was not empty. She filled it not with words, but with her own self, and there was something in that he had been refusing without knowing it for 5 entire years. "The Eastern Field figures are better than Carrick originally estimated," she said without looking up. "The remediation approach saved approximately £40. You negotiated the materials cost." "I did." A brief look up. "You heard that." "I hear most things. I've been paying attention." She set down her pen, looked at him fully. It was the longest she had held his gaze since he arrived, and he did not look away. "What are you going to do," she asked, "when you go back?" "Go back to what I had before nothing." He held her eyes. "I cannot go back to what I had before. I don't mean in the sentimental sense. I mean practically the man who ran those 4 estates, in the way I ran them without seeing the people in them, without seeing my own wife. That man produced something that looked like success and was actually an elaborate avoidance of every real thing." He leaned forward, both forearms on the table. "I have a great deal of work to do, and not all of it is at Hawthorne." She considered him. "I'm not coming back to Hawthorne," she said. It was not cruel. It was clear. "I'm not asking you to. Not yet. Maybe not at all in the way it was before." He held steady. "What I'm asking is whether you would consider slowly, without obligation, in whatever form makes sense, allowing me to be part of what you've built here. Not to take it over. Not to redirect it. To contribute to it." He paused. "On your terms." The kitchen fire spoke. The candle between them threw warm shadows. Helen was quiet for a long time. Her hands were flat on the table beside the account book, and she looked at them and then back at him. "There is a meeting next Thursday," she said carefully, "with the county surveyor about the boundary claim on the northern ridge. It's a complicated piece of property law, and I have prepared an argument, but I would benefit from a second view on the legal elements." He recognized what this was. Not an invitation to return. Not reconciliation. A specific, bounded, practical offer: come to a meeting. Contribute to a problem. Prove in actual fact, rather than in apology, whether you are the man you say you are. "I'll be there," he said. She picked up her pen, returned to the accounts. But something had shifted in the kitchen, in the quality of the air between them, almost too fine to name. Not restored. Nothing so complete as that. Something smaller and more honest, the first true understanding between two people who had spent 5 years in the same house without once having it. Outside, the sun was beginning to come up over the Virginia fields. Helen's fields, now tended by her hands and her will and her early mornings. The light came in low and flat through the kitchen window and fell across the account book and across her bent head, and Joseph Hawthorne sat across from his wife and looked at her, and finally, after 5 years of looking past, saw. It did not fix what was broken. 1 morning and 2 days could not do that, and he had enough self-knowledge now to understand the scale of what had been lost and what it would require to rebuild. There was no shortcut through it, no single apology that unlocked the door. There was only the long, slow daily work of becoming someone different. Not for her sake, though, partly for her sake, but because he had sat in a cold study and read 12 letters and looked in the mirror. They held up and found he could not tolerate the reflection. He would come back Thursday. He would attend the meeting. He would do the legal preparation and sit beside her and contribute as a partner, not as a manager or a rescuer or a man arriving to retrieve what he'd left behind. And after that meeting, there would be another one. Another problem. Another morning. Another small act of showing up in the way he had never shown up when she was the one waiting. He did not know if it would be enough. He suspected it might not be for a long time. But he was going to find out. Helen turned a page, made a note. The pen scratched quietly. Across the kitchen table, Joseph finally started paying attention. He came back Thursday. He had told himself on the ride back to Hawthorne Estate after those 2 days at Langford that he would not count the days until Thursday. That he would return to his work, attend to his responsibilities, conduct himself with the discipline of a man who understood that what he was attempting to rebuild could not be rushed. He counted every day. Tuesday was interminable. Wednesday was worse. He sat through 2 board meetings and a legal consultation about the Greaves property survey, and retained almost nothing from any of them, which was so unlike him that his steward, a careful man named Timms, who had served the estate for 11 years, asked twice whether everything was in order. "Everything is fine, Timms." Timms did not look convinced. But he was a careful man, and careful men did not push where they weren't invited. Joseph rode to Langford Thursday morning before sunrise. He arrived as Helen was finishing breakfast. He could see through the kitchen window, not because he was watching in any unseemly way, but because he arrived early, and the kitchen light was the first one he saw, and through it he could see her sitting at the table with her tea and her papers composed and unhurried, entirely unaware of him at the gate. He stood there for a moment before announcing himself. He had done this, he realized, more times in the last week than in 5 years of marriage, simply stopped and looked at her. Simply let himself see what was actually there, instead of processing her presence and moving on to the next matter requiring his attention. She looked up from her papers when Abigail answered the door and came back to tell her. Her expression moved through surprise, something else too quick to name, and then settled into the composed professionalism she wore for purposeful occasions. "You're early," she said when he came in. "I rode before light." "You didn't sleep again." "I slept adequately." He held her gaze. "I wanted to be here, and I didn't want to be late." Something moved briefly in her face. She gestured toward the chair across from hers. "Sit down. The meeting is at 10. We have time to go over the argument first." The county surveyor's name was Bartholomew Crane, a compact, precise man who arrived with 2 assistants and a leather case full of maps and precedent documents, and who clearly had not expected Lord Hawthorne to be present at what he'd understood to be a straightforward boundary consultation with Lady Langford. He recovered well. But Joseph caught the recalibration, the slight shift, as Crane reassessed the room's power dynamics, the instinct to address the man rather than the woman who had arranged the meeting. Helen caught it too. Of course she did. "Mr. Crane," she said before Crane had fully settled his papers, "I am the landowner in this matter. Lord Hawthorne is here at my invitation to provide a second perspective on the legal points. The discussion runs through me." Crane blinked, adjusted, nodded with the good sense of a professional who could read a room once it had been clearly labeled. "Of course, Lady Langford." Joseph sat back and watched his wife conduct the meeting, and it was like watching a master craftsman work she had prepared with the thoroughness of someone who understood that preparation was itself a form of authority. She knew every document Crane produced before he produced it. She anticipated his counter-arguments. She conceded the points where concession cost her nothing, and pressed hard on the points where she was right and knew it, and she was always accurate about which was which. 20 minutes in, Crane stopped trying to find angles she hadn't considered and started simply answering her questions. Joseph contributed once a specific point of property law regarding inherited boundary claims that Helen had flagged as uncertain, which he knew from a similar dispute in the Carolina holdings. She listened, integrated it immediately, turned it into an argument that was sharper than the version he'd sketched, and pressed it home. Crane conceded the northern ridge on 4 of the 6 contested points. After he left, Helen stood at the table with the final agreed map in her hands, and Joseph watched her read it over once, twice, and set it down with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has gotten precisely what she went in for. "The legal point on inherited claims," she said. "That was useful. You took it somewhere I wouldn't have gone. I had the better context for how to apply it. It was not a compliment exchange. It was something more functional, and he was beginning to understand more intimate than a compliment. It was 2 people acknowledging each other's competence without theater or performance. He had conducted that kind of exchange 1,000 times with lawyers and business partners. He had never done it with his wife. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She met his eyes, nodded. "How long have you been doing this? The property management, the legal arguments, the accounts." He gestured at the room without looking away from her. "Not at Langford, I understand Langford is recent. But this way of thinking. How long?" Helen was quiet for a moment. "Since the 2nd year of our marriage," she said, "when I realized I needed something that was mine." The sentence landed precisely. He had given her a house. He had given her a household to manage. He had given her a social position and an estate, and every material thing a woman in 1818 Virginia could reasonably expect. He had given her everything except the one thing that actually fed a person, the knowledge that there was space for her particular self in the world she inhabited. So she had found it somewhere else. She had found it in books and account books and tenants' problems and village school meetings and county surveyors, and she had built a life of the mind and purpose entirely inside the margins of a marriage that had no room for her in its center, and he had never noticed. "Helen, don't." She said it without unkindness. "I know what you're going to say, and I don't need you to say it. I need you to understand it, which is a different thing. I'm trying to. I know you are." She folded the agreed map with careful hands. "That's why I let you come Thursday." He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. He did not announce it as a pattern. He did not negotiate terms or make declarations. He simply appeared Thursday mornings before the household was fully awake, and by the 3rd Thursday, Helen had stopped looking surprised when Abigail told her he was at the gate. He sat in on her tenant meetings. He rode the property with Carrick when she went over the repair progress. He read the same land survey texts she had sent for from Richmond, and when he had questions, he brought them to her rather than consulting his own estate agents, because his agents would give him the answers that fit his properties. And Helen's reading had been shaped by Langford's specific challenges, and that was what he needed. The conversations that grew between them in those Thursday visits were unlike anything they had managed in 5 years of marriage. They were conversations between two people who had things to say to each other, specific, particular, informed things that neither of them had known the other was capable of contributing because neither of them had ever tried this way before. One Thursday, he arrived to find her in what he would later call the argument of the season. Mrs. Pryor was there. She seemed to materialize whenever complications arose, which Joseph had concluded was not coincidence, but design. And so was a man named Aldous Birch, representing the interests of his employer, a Mr. Cardew, whose family claimed adjacent land rights predating the Langford title. Birch was smooth, well-dressed, the particular kind of polished that came from years of being paid to be persuasive, and he had clearly arrived expecting to deal with a woman alone and maneuver accordingly. He did not get that. Helen stood at the head of her own table and looked at Birch with the expression of someone who has read every relevant document and has already thought of every argument he is about to make. "The Cardew claim," she said before Birch had completed his preamble, "rests on a 1791 survey that was conducted during a boundary dispute that was itself resolved in 1793 by the colonial court in favor of the Langford predecessors. I have the 1793 ruling. I assume you have it as well." Birch paused, recalibrated. The 1793 ruling addressed a different portion of the boundary. It addressed the western boundary. "You're here about the northern. I understand the distinction," she tilted her head. "But the precedent established in 1793 regarding the evidentiary weight of pre-1790 surveys applies, regardless of which boundary section is in question. Mr. Birch, your employer is relying on a survey that 2 separate legal proceedings have already discounted. That's not a claim. That's a hope." Mrs. Pryor, sitting to the side with her tea, produced a sound that might have been a cough and might have been something else entirely. Joseph watched Birch try 3 more approaches. Helen took each one apart with the clean efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for weeks, which he now knew, because he had seen the preparation, the notes on her desk. The texts she'd sent for the evenings she'd spent at that kitchen table after supper was cleared reading by candlelight. Birch left without a concession. Helen turned from the door and found Joseph looking at her. "You knew he was coming. Carrick's wife told me." Birch had been asking questions in the village about the property title. She moved back to the table, began stacking the documents with calm efficiency. "I had 2 weeks to prepare." "You didn't mention it to me." She paused. "No, I didn't." The honesty of that landed between them clearly. She had not mentioned it because until recently she had not been in the habit of sharing her challenges with him. Because for 5 years, sharing things with Joseph had meant receiving 2-line replies and watching them disappear into his indifference. The habit of not telling him was protective, reasonable, and it would take time to undo if it could be undone at all. "I would have liked to know," he said carefully. "Not to handle it. I clearly had nothing to add to how you handled it, but—" He stopped, found the right version. "I would have liked to know, because it matters to you. That's enough reason." Helen looked at him for a long moment, set down the papers. "That's the first time," she said slowly, "that you have ever said something like that to me." It hit him harder than Birch's 3 arguments combined. "I know." Edward arrived on a Saturday uninvited, because he always arrived everywhere uninvited, and because he had been watching his brother make weekly rides to Langford for 6 weeks, and had decided it was time to see the situation for himself. He arrived at Langford while Joseph was there, which was, Helen strongly suspected, not an accident. Edward Hawthorne did not do accidental things. She had always liked Edward. He was the member of the Hawthorne family who had seen her from the beginning. Not perfectly, not with full understanding, but with the genuine effort to look that Joseph had never offered. When she'd arrived at Langford 6 weeks ago, heartbroken in the contained way of a woman who no longer cried but still felt everything. Edward's note had arrived 4 days later. "You are right to go. I hope you find what you are looking for. You will." She had kept that note. Edward shook her hand at the door with real warmth, kissed her cheek, said she looked magnificent, which she suspected was true, and also calculated to make a point to his brother. Then he sat at the kitchen table with the ease of a man who was equally comfortable in every room, looked between the two of them and said, "Right, what's actually happening here?" "We are working," Joseph said. "I can see that. I've been watching you work from the county road." Edward helped himself to tea without being invited. "What I'm asking is what's happening between the two of you, because last I checked my sister-in-law had left, and my brother had finally realized he'd driven her to it. And 6 weeks later, they appear to be in some sort of productive arrangement that nobody has defined, and both of them are pretending is simpler than it is." Helen wrapped both hands around her own cup and did not look at Joseph. "We're figuring it out," she said. "What does that mean precisely?" "It means what it means." She met Edward's eyes. "It means we are both being careful, and both being honest, and not rushing anything because of social pressure or the inconvenience of an unconventional arrangement." Edward looked at Joseph. "She's right," Joseph said. "I know she's right. I'm checking whether you know it." Edward set his cup down. "Because there's a difference between a man who comes every Thursday because he's genuinely building something different, and a man who comes every Thursday because it eases his guilt and he's hoping proximity will do the rest of the work." The kitchen went very quiet. It was the question Joseph had been asking himself every single week on the ride down in the honest dark hours, when he could not dress his motivations in flattering language. He had asked it and examined his own answer and not been entirely satisfied, which was itself a kind of progress a year ago he would not have known to ask. "Both, probably," he said. "The guilt is there. I don't think I can separate it out cleanly, but it's not what drives the ride down." "What does—" Joseph glanced at Helen. She was looking at her cup. "I like who she is," he said. "I should have found that out years ago. I'm finding it out now. And every time I come here and see something else, something she's done, something she knows, some way she handles a situation, I find that I am—" He stopped, pressed forward. "I am genuinely interested. In her. Not in resolving my own culpability. In her." Silence. Helen had gone very still. Edward looked between them with the expression of a man watching something he has been hoping to see and is not entirely sure has arrived yet. He said. The same sound Mrs. Pryor had made after dinner that first night. Something in the Langford air, apparently, that reduced honest men to non-committal sounds. Helen stood, took her cup to the sink, stood with her back to them for a moment, which was the only evidence she gave that Joseph's words had landed anywhere at all. "Stay for dinner," she said to Edward. "Mrs. Pryor is coming. She will enjoy interrogating you. She interrogated me last time I was here. She interrogates everyone. It's how she decides whether to trust them." "Did she decide to trust me?" Helen turned from the sink. And for the first time in weeks, the first time since Joseph had arrived at the gate to find her laughing with the farmer in the yard, she smiled at him without composure in it. Just a smile. Just herself. She said, "You were almost as infuriating as your brother, but considerably less oblivious." Edward laughed. Joseph, after a moment, did too. And Helen, watching them, allowed herself something she hadn't in a very long time. The feeling that the room she was standing in contained people who were glad to be in it. The letter came on a Wednesday. Not from the county. Not from a surveyor or a legal agent or Mrs. Pryor. From a woman named Cecily Morrow, whose name Joseph did not recognize, and whose connection to Helen he did not immediately understand until he read 2 lines over Helen's shoulder. She had not asked him to read it, but she was standing at the kitchen window and did not move away when he came close, which he took as permission. Cecily Morrow was the daughter of the family from whom Helen's mother had originally leased property in the years before Helen's birth. They had corresponded since Helen was 14. They had not seen each other in 6 years. and Cecily was coming to Virginia in February with her husband, and wished to call on Helen at Langford if the invitation was extended. "An old friend," Joseph said. "My oldest." Helen folded the letter. "She knew me before I was Lady Hawthorne, before I was anyone's wife." A pause. "She knew me when I still knew myself." The sentence landed softly and went deep. He watched her hold the folded letter. "You should write back today," he said. "Invite them properly. I'll arrange whatever's needed for the visit." Helen turned, looked at him. "You don't need to. I want to." He held steady. "She's important to you. That makes her worth arranging properly." He watched her face. "You're allowed to have things that matter. That's not something you have to negotiate for." Something shifted behind her eyes. A crack in something small, controlled, but real. "You didn't used to think that," she said quietly. "No, I didn't." He held her gaze. "I was wrong about a great many things. That's near the top." She turned back to the window. He couldn't see her face. "Joseph." Her voice was careful, measured. The tone of a woman choosing each word before she releases it. "I need you to understand something. About why this what you're doing coming every week what you said to Edward. Why it's difficult. Tell me. Because I spent 5 years hoping for exactly this. This version of you. The one who notices. The one who says, she matters to me." She kept her face toward the window. "And now you're here. And you're saying those things. And doing them. And part of me." She stopped. "Part of you. Part of me doesn't trust it." Her voice didn't waver. "Not because you're lying. I don't think you're lying. But because I spent 5 years adjusting myself, reducing what I needed, teaching myself to expect less, and I got very good at it." She turned, and her face was composed, but her eyes were not entirely. "And now you're asking me to unlearn that, to believe that you see me, to risk hoping again." A long pause. "Do you understand what you're asking me to risk?" I did. He understood it in his chest and his gut, and the part of a man that knows when he has done real damage and cannot undo it quickly or easily, or through the force of his own desire to fix what he broke. "Yes," he said. "I understand exactly what I'm asking." "Then you understand why I can't just—" She pressed her lips together. "Why it takes time." "Yes." "And you're not going to push, or hurry, or decide that because you've understood the problem should be resolved. No." He held her gaze. "I'm going to come back next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and you don't owe me anything for it." She looked at him for a long moment. "The letter," she said at last. "I'll write to Cecily today. I'll arrange the guest rooms. You don't have to stay for the visit." "I know I don't." She held his eyes. Something moved in them. Not resolution, not surrender, not even trust exactly. Something earlier than trust. The first conditions of trust, maybe. The soft ground where it might eventually take root if everything that came after was handled with sufficient care. "All right," she said, very quietly. It was not a declaration. It was not even a promise. It was a woman who had loved someone in silence for 5 years and walked away from it and built something real in the aftermath, allowing carefully, provisionally, with full knowledge of the risk. The possibility that the man standing in her kitchen might be becoming someone worth believing in. Outside December settled over the Virginia fields, cold and clear, the kind of air that stripped things down to their essentials and left only what was real. Joseph picked up his coat from the chair where he'd left it. The ride back to Hawthorne was long. He had estate correspondence piling up that he'd been managing in the evenings to keep his Thursdays free, and his steward Timms had the look of a man developing opinions he was too professional to express, and there were approximately 40 legitimate reasons the next 6 weeks would be complicated. He didn't think about any of them. I thought about the way she'd said all right, 2 small words carrying the full weight of everything they'd both been through and everything that was still unresolved, and the precise quality of fragile beginning that it represented. Not a happy ending. Something more honest than that. A woman who had every reason not to hope, choosing very carefully to leave a door slightly open. I wasn't going to walk through it uninvited. He wasn't going to rush or push or mistake her careful consideration for something that could be hurried by want or guilt or any force available to a man. But he was going to be there. Every Thursday. In the manner she'd asked for, contributing without taking over, seeing without performing, showing up without demanding that his showing up be rewarded. He put on his coat, said goodbye to Abigail in the hall, went out into the December cold. He had a long ride ahead of him and a longer road beyond that. For the first time in 40 years of managing things, he was glad for the difficulty. Glad because the difficulty was real, and the real things, the ones that cost something, the ones you couldn't manage or negotiate or settle with a contract, those were the ones that actually mattered. He had spent his whole life avoiding that knowledge. He was done avoiding it. The horse moved out onto the county road, and Langford fell behind him, and Joseph Hawthorne rode north into the winter dark, carrying something he hadn't possessed in 5 years of marriage and couldn't have named even a month ago. The specific, earned, fragile hope of a man who has finally started paying attention. Cecily Morrow arrived on a Tuesday in February, which was not what anyone had planned. She had written that she would come Friday. Joseph had arranged the guest rooms coordinated with Langford's kitchen, ridden down from Hawthorne the Sunday before, to make certain everything was in order, all of it carefully, without making a production of the care, because he had learned in the past 2 months that the surest way to undermine any progress between himself and Helen was to make his efforts visible enough to require her acknowledgement. But Cecily arrived Tuesday in a hired carriage with her husband George trailing behind her with the expression of a man who had long ago made peace with his wife's sense of timing, and she came through the door of Langford with her arms already open before Helen had fully crossed the entrance hall. Joseph was in the small study off the hallway, reviewing the northern boundary documentation, when he heard it, the sound that stopped his pen mid-stroke. Helen's voice. Not the composed, measured voice he had spent 2 months learning the cadences of. Something older than that. Something that had existed before 5 years of a quiet marriage had shaped it into restraint. She was laughing, fully, without management or performance. The way a person laughs when they are with someone who has known them so long that there is nothing left to perform. He sat very still at the desk and listened to it and did not go out into the hall, because some moments are not for witnessing, and he had learned slowly and at real cost to himself the difference between being present and intruding. When he did emerge, 20 minutes later, the three of them were in the kitchen, Cecily and Helen at the table, George Morrow standing near the window with tea and the comfortable posture of a man accustomed to being in rooms where his wife is the primary force of nature. Cecily was a compact, energetic woman with an expressive face and the directness of someone who had never found small talk particularly interesting. She assessed Joseph in approximately 4 seconds when Helen introduced him, and her assessment was so obvious and so thorough that George touched his wife's arm once in the mild way of a man who has done this before. "It's fine," Cecily said without looking at her husband. "I'm just looking." Then to Joseph. "Helen wrote me when she came to Langford. She told me what happened." "Cecily," Helen began, "he should know what I know." Cecily's eyes did not leave Joseph. "She told me she had left. She told me why. She told me that she had finally, after 5 years, decided to stop trying to make a home with a man who did not see her." A pause. "She did not tell me you had come after her. She did not tell me about the Thursdays. I found that out from her last letter 3 weeks ago." Another pause. "I want to know what changed." George Morrow looked at the ceiling with the patient expression of a man who has had considerable practice at not being where he is. Helen had gone quiet at the table, her hands around her cup watching. Joseph looked at Cecily Morrow. This woman who had known his wife at 14, who had corresponded with her through everything, who had been the recipient of the truths Helen could not say inside their marriage, and understood that what was being asked of him was not a social answer. "I read letters she never sent me," he said, "and I understood that I had lived alongside someone extraordinary for 5 years and treated her presence as a given. The way you treat a roof, you don't think about it until it's gone." He held Cecily's gaze. "I am not asking to have back what I wasted. I am trying to become someone worth what she has managed to build without me." Silence. Cecily turned to Helen. Helen was looking at Joseph with an expression he could not fully read. Something layered, complicated, a woman sorting through responses and finding none of them entirely adequate. Cecily said. Which was, Joseph was coming to understand the sound that women in Helen's life made when they had received an answer that was better than expected, but had not yet decided what to do with it. George refilled his own tea with the philosophical calm of a man who has learned that the important conversations in a house rarely involve him. Cecily stayed 5 days. In those 5 days, Joseph learned more about his wife than he had in 5 years of living with her. Not because Cecily was indiscreet. She was not. She was in fact precise about what she shared and what she kept. But because watching Helen with her oldest friend was like watching someone read a language they had almost forgotten. Something unlocked. Something moved. He saw Helen argue. Properly argue, not the measured disagreements she managed with surveyors and legal men, but the full-throated back and forth of two people who knew each other well enough to say exactly what they thought. They argued about a novel on the second night. Then about a decision Cecily's husband had made regarding their property that Helen thought was financially unsound. Then about whether Helen had made the right choice leaving Hawthorne. And this one. This argument happened across the sitting room, while Joseph was at the other end of it, with a book he was no longer reading. "I'm not saying it was wrong." Cecily's voice heated rapid. "I'm saying you could have fought harder." "I fought for 5 years." Helen's voice equally heated, equally rapid. "You don't get to tell me I should have continued after 5 years." "I'm not saying continue. I'm saying—" Cecily stopped, exhaled, lowered her voice, but not enough. "I'm saying that you are the most capable person I have ever known, and you accepted less than you deserved for longer than you should have. I know that. And now he's here making it right. He's trying. Those are not the same thing. Helen, I know the difference between someone trying to be better and someone who is better. I have been watching very carefully for 2 months, and he is trying, genuinely. But I will not confuse the effort with the arrival." Her voice dropped further, but Joseph had stopped pretending to read. "Because the last time I believed the arrival had come, I spent 5 years finding out I was wrong." Silence from Cecily's side of the room. Then, "That's fair." "Yes, it is." Joseph turned a page he had not read. His chest was full of something he had no precise name for, the peculiar pain of hearing someone speak the truth about you with perfect accuracy from across a room, and knowing you have no argument, and also knowing that the truth is not the worst thing you have ever heard because it means she is still engaged enough to have an opinion. He stayed in his chair. He did not interrupt. He turned another unread page. Later that night, after Cecily and George had gone to bed, and Helen was banking the fire in the sitting room, Joseph set down his book and said quietly, "I heard you, earlier." Helen's back was to him. She went still for a moment. "I know," she said. "The room doesn't carry sound as well as you might think. I heard you stop turning pages." He absorbed that. She had known he was listening and had said it anyway. Had said the true thing about him in front of him without softening it or redirecting it because he was present. That he was beginning to understand was what honesty actually looked like. Not performance of candor, just the thing itself spoken at its natural volume. "You're right," he said. "The trying is not the arrival. I'm not asking you to mistake one for the other." Helen set down the fire iron, turned. "What are you asking, Joseph?" Her voice was not unkind. It was tired in the way of someone who has carried a question for a long time. To be allowed to keep trying, without a deadline, without a guarantee. He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to believe I've arrived. I'm asking you to let the journey continue." She looked at him for a long moment in the dying firelight. "Go to bed," she said finally. Not cruelly. With the particular gentleness of a woman who needs to end a conversation before it asks more of her than she has decided to give tonight. "It's late." He went to bed. He stared at the ceiling of the Langford guest room for a long time before sleep came. And when it came, he dreamed of nothing useful and woke before light with the specific restlessness of a man in the middle of something he cannot control. I was not accustomed to that. He was learning to sit with it anyway. The crisis came on the fourth day of Cecily's visit from a direction no one had anticipated, and it arrived in the form of a letter from Hawthorne Estate that reached Joseph at breakfast. He read it twice, set it face down on the table, looked at his coffee. "What is it?" Helen was watching him from across the table. She had learned in 2 months of Thursdays to read the small shifts in his expression, the particular stillness that meant something had happened that required management. A complication at the estate. He kept his voice even. The Eastern tenant dispute, the one I told you about in January, the Ferris family against the Howell claim, has escalated. My steward says there's talk of a county hearing. It requires my presence. He looked up. I need to leave today. Something moved across Helen's face. Something quick and controlled, and if he had not been paying very close attention for 2 months, entirely invisible. He had become very good at paying very close attention. "You should go," she said. Her voice was steady. "Helen, there's a legitimate dispute requiring your presence. You should go." She refilled her coffee, did not look at him. He looked at her hands. They were perfectly still around the cup. Too still for Helen, who was usually subtly in motion, pen-tapping fingers moving the constant quiet restlessness of an active mind. "Say it," he said. She looked up. "Say what you're actually thinking, not the sensible version." A silence. Cecily, appearing in the doorway with her husband behind her, took one reading of the room and turned directly around, pulling George with her by the elbow. The door to the hallway closed quietly. Helen set down her cup. Fine. 2 days ago, she might have kept the sensible version. 2 months of Thursdays had shifted something, perhaps more than she'd intended. Every time something was urgent at the estate, you left. Every time I arranged something, dinner and evening a moment, the estate was urgent and you left. And I told myself every single time that this time was different, that the circumstances were genuinely unavoidable, that I was being unreasonable to feel what I felt. She held his gaze. "I am not saying you shouldn't go. The dispute is real, and you need to handle it. I am telling you what happens in my chest when I hear that something is urgent and you have to leave." He did not defend himself. He did not explain the differences between this situation and the past ones, though. The differences were real, and he could have articulated them. He just held her gaze and let what she had said sit in the air between them exactly as she had placed it. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Don't thank me for it." Her voice had an edge now, not anger, something rawer than anger. "Just understand it, remember it. Because every time you say you're paying attention, I have to decide whether to believe you. And moments like this are how I make that decision." He stood, walked to where she was sitting. Did not touch her. He had not touched her in 2 months, had kept deliberate distance because she had not given him any sign that contact was welcome, and he had learned slowly and humiliatingly that what he wanted did not set the terms here. He crouched down so they were at eye level. It was not a natural posture for a man of his build and bearing, and it was entirely deliberate. "I am going to handle the dispute," he said quietly. "I am going to ride to Hawthorne today. I am going to attend every detail of the Ferris situation and resolve it as quickly as it can honestly be resolved. And then I am going to come back." He held her gaze. "Not because the schedule says Thursday. Because I want to be here. Because this," he gestured slightly, meaning the kitchen, meaning Langford, meaning her, "is where I choose to be when I'm not needed somewhere else." She looked at him for a long moment. "When did you get better at this?" she asked. It was barely above a whisper. "I had a very good teacher." He straightened. "She didn't know she was teaching me. She was just living. I was finally watching." He left an hour later. Cecily stood with Helen at the gate and watched the horse move out onto the county road and said nothing for a full minute. Then, "All right, he might actually be serious." "He is serious," Helen said. "That's different from whether it's enough." "I know." Helen watched the road long after the horse had gone. "I'm still deciding." "I was back in 9 days. Not Thursday. A Wednesday." He rode through rain that had turned the county roads into something close to unnavigable, arrived with mud on his coat and his hat, and the look of a man who had not calculated comfort into the decision. Helen was in the main room with Cecily and George, who were packing the last of their things for their departure the following morning. She heard the horse, and then heard Abigail at the door, and then looked up to find Joseph standing in the doorway of the main room, with Rain on his shoulders and an expression of a man who has accomplished something he needed to accomplish, and returned as quickly as he honestly could. He looked at her. The Ferris dispute is settled, entirely. I restructured the boundary agreement and provided both families a compensation arrangement that removes any grounds for the county hearing. He was still in his wet coat. He hadn't stopped to remove it. I left at first light this morning. Cecily looked at George. George looked at the ceiling with an expression of profound interest in the plasterwork. Helen stood, crossed the room. And she did something she had not done since leaving Hawthorne. She reached out and took the lapel of his wet coat between her fingers, examining the mud on it with the focused attention of someone finding a place to put their eyes while they organize their feelings. "You're soaked through," she said. "It's raining." I noticed. She released his lapel, looked up at him. Something in her face was doing something complicated. "Thank you for coming back. I said I would." "You've said things before." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I know the difference between then and now better than anyone, but I understand why you're still counting." Cecily made a sound from the far end of the room that was drowned out by George saying something to her in a low, urgent voice. Helen stepped back. The practical shell reassembled itself with the fluency of long habit. "Go change. You'll be useless sick." He went. But at the door, he paused because there was something in the way she had touched his coat, not romantically, not in any way that declared itself, just the simple instinct of a woman checking on someone's welfare that told him something had shifted. Not resolved. Shifted. He would take it. Cecily left the next morning. She and Helen stood together in the early cold for a long moment before Cecily climbed into the carriage, and Joseph, watching from a distance that gave them privacy, could not hear what passed between them. He saw Cecily cup Helen's face in both hands briefly, the gesture of a woman saying something that matters. He saw Helen nod. He saw Cecily's eyes move briefly to him, assess, and return to Helen with something in them that might have been, if he was reading it correctly, cautious approval. Then the carriage was gone, and Helen stood at the gate watching it, and Joseph came to stand beside her. They stood without speaking for a while. "What did she say?" he asked, not because he had a right to know, but because something in Helen's face told him she might want to be asked. "She said..." Helen paused, exhaled. "She said that watching you these 5 days reminded her of something her father once told her. That the measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes. It's whether they can bear to fully understand what they've done." Another pause. "She said she thinks you're bearing it." He absorbed that. "What do you think?" Helen was quiet for a long time. The morning was cold and clear. Out in the fields, Carrick's voice could be heard directing the morning work. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am beginning to trust the Thursdays. And the Wednesday in the rain." She still hadn't looked at him. "And the way you crouched down at the kitchen table, so we were eye to eye, which is not something you would have thought to do 6 months ago." He said nothing. He was learning that some things she said were not for responding to, they were for receiving. "I think," she continued even more carefully, "that there is a difference between the man who read my letters and wept at his desk. And I know you did, Joseph. You don't have to tell me I know you, and the man who has ridden here every week since and sat in tenant meetings and county surveys and said almost nothing about what any of it costs him." She turned at last. Her eyes on his were steady and complicated. "That second man is harder to build than the first. Grief is easy. Grief is one night. It's the Thursdays that are hard." "Yes," he said. "They are." "And you keep coming." "Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment. And then, for the first time since he had arrived at her gate in December, for the first time since the night she had placed a letter on his desk and walked away, Helen Hawthorne reached out and touched his hand. Not a grasp. Just her fingers resting briefly on his, the way you test ice to see whether it will hold. It was the smallest possible gesture. It was enormous. He did not move, did not grip, did not do anything that would make it into something she hadn't offered. She withdrew her hand after a moment, looked back toward the fields. "The Northern Ridge survey results come next week," she said. Her voice was back to the practical register, the business of a woman who runs a property. "Mr. Crane is sending his final report. I would like you to be here when I read it." "I'll be here Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday is not Thursday." "No, it isn't." He looked at her profile. "You asked me to be here for something specific. I'll be here for the specific thing." A beat. 2. "Tuesday then," she said, and that was all. It was not a declaration or a restoration or anything that could be wrapped in clean language and presented as a turning point. It was a woman who had been hurt in ways that did not heal quickly, choosing day by day to extend the range of what she permitted. Not because she was sure it was safe, because she was watching very carefully and deciding that the evidence accumulated Thursday by Thursday, Wednesday by Wednesday, warranted the extension. It was the hardest kind of courage. The kind that doesn't look like courage from the outside because it's quiet and it's slow and it doesn't announce itself. Joseph understood that now. He understood it because he had spent 2 months watching her practice it, and because he had been, for the first time in his life, the person that someone else had to be brave about. He did not like knowing that. He was glad he knew it anyway. How was their Tuesday? The survey results were favorable. The Northern Ridge claim was confirmed in full. Helen read the final page, set the document on the desk, and sat back in her chair with the exhale of someone who has been carrying a weight they didn't entirely realize they were carrying. Joseph watched her. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked at the document, then at him. And something in her face was different from all the previous times, all the careful composure and the measured distances and the precise management of what she allowed herself to feel in front of him. Something was tired. Not the tired of defeat, the tired of effort, the tired of a woman who has been holding herself at a particular tension for a very long time and is just beginning to feel whether it might be safe to relax it. "Joseph," she said. "Yes. I don't know yet." She held his gaze and her eyes were very direct. "I want you to know that I genuinely do not know yet what this is, what it can become. Whether the thing we might build will be what I actually need, or only what I am used to." A pause. "I am being honest with you because I think you have earned that, and because I am done saying things I don't mean in order to make situations comfortable." "I know you don't know," he said. "I don't know either. I know what I want. I don't know if I deserve it. Those are different calculations." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "They are." Outside, the February afternoon was moving toward evening. The property was quieting workers heading in the particular settling of a day that is ending without drama. "Stay for supper," Helen said. It was not warm, not cold. It was an offer extended without theater in the same voice she used for practical arrangements. And yet, he had learned enough in 2 months of careful attention to know that the practical voice was not the full measure of what it carried. He had learned that Helen Langford Hawthorne communicated the things that mattered most in the exact voice she used for everything else, and that the only way to hear them was to pay close attention and not mistake understatement for absence. She had invited him to supper. She had not done that before. "Yes," he said, simply, without making more of it than she had offered. "Thank you." She nodded, stood, moved toward the kitchen with the practical efficiency of a woman with something to direct. Joseph sat in the chair for another moment after she left the room. He looked at the favorable survey document on the desk. He looked at the door through which she had gone. The house around him was warm and working and alive in the way that a home is not a managed property, not a correctly functioning estate, but a place where someone actually lived. Where the fire was built by someone who wanted warmth, not because the household schedule required it. Where the flowers on the kitchen table existed because Helen liked flowers, not because the table was supposed to have them. He had not known the difference once. He was learning it now. He got up, rolled his sleeves, and went to the kitchen to ask if there was anything he could do to help. Not as a gesture, not as evidence of his reformed character, simply because supper needed to be made, and he was present and capable, and the days of treating effort as someone else's obligation were done. Abigail, stirring something at the stove, looked at him with open surprise. Helen at the table cutting bread did not look up. But the very faintest thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, not quite. Something earlier than a smile. The soft ground where one might grow. He picked up the thing Abigail pointed him toward and started on it. The kitchen filled with warm sound and warm smell. And somewhere in the middle of it, without announcement or ceremony, Joseph Hawthorne stopped being a visitor at Langford and started being in the smallest and most important sense present. That was all. And it was everything. Supper that Tuesday became supper the following Tuesday. Not by negotiation, not by announcement, simply by the logic of a thing that had found its natural rhythm. Joseph would arrive, help with whatever needed doing, sit at the kitchen table, while Helen worked through the day's remaining correspondence, and stay for the evening meal. Abigail stopped looking surprised when he picked something up without being asked. Carrick stopped addressing his work questions exclusively to Helen when Joseph was present. The Langford household absorbed him the way a living thing absorbs what it finds useful, gradually, without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it into something it wasn't ready to be. Helen did not name it. Joseph did not name it. They moved around each other with the careful fluency of two people who have been hurt by assumption and are not going to make that mistake again. But the Tuesdays became a pattern alongside the Thursdays. And then one week in late February, when a storm made the county road genuinely impassable, Joseph stayed 3 days without either of them making a significant point of it. He slept in the guest room. He rose before Helen, which she discovered one morning when she came downstairs at 5 to find the kitchen fire already built and coffee already on, and Joseph at the table with the estate correspondence he'd been managing by candlelight so his days at Langford could remain available. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She looked at the fire, then at the coffee, then at him. She sat down, poured herself a cup, and opened her own correspondence without saying a word about it. That was the morning she decided she was done not naming it. She waited, though, because the timing mattered. She had learned through 5 years of a marriage that went wrong that the timing of a conversation was nearly as important as the conversation itself, and she was not going to say the thing she needed to say in a passing moment, or over a practical matter, or in any context that would allow it to be absorbed without full attention. She waited until March, until a Thursday evening when the last of the winter was finally loosening its grip and the county road was dry enough that riding back to Hawthorne was practical, and Joseph was pulling on his coat in the entrance hall with the routine ease of a man who has made this departure many times and knows its rhythms. Joseph. She came into the hall. Abigail was elsewhere. The house was quiet. He turned. Read her face. And he went still in the way he did now when he understood that she had something to say that was not practical, had not yet learned to move toward it, but had learned to stop and make room for it. "I'm not going to keep not saying it," she began. Her voice was steady. She had prepared this not in the sense of a speech, but in the sense of a woman who has thought something through until it is as clear as she can get it. "We have been doing this for 3 months, the Thursdays, the Tuesdays, the 3 days in the snow, and it has been good. Genuinely good. Better than I expected, and better than I was prepared for." She paused. "And I have been watching you very carefully because you told me to watch and because I needed to, and what I have seen is a man who is trying in the specific, daily, unglamorous way that I once would have given everything for." He said nothing. He waited. "I am not the woman who waited for you," she continued. "I want to make that absolutely clear. That woman is gone. And I do not want her back even now, even with this." She gestured between them. "What I am telling you is that the woman I am now, the one who settled the Birch dispute and built the school arrangement and read the drainage texts and learned to manage her own land, that woman is choosing to look at you. Choosing it. Not from need, not from loneliness. From—" She stopped. The composed voice held a fraction less steadily. "From something that has been growing since December, and that I have run out of good reasons to pretend isn't there." Joseph took his coat off, set it on the chair beside him, turned back to her. "Tell me what you need," he said, quietly, directly, no preamble. "I need you to understand that this is not a return to what we had." Her eyes were very clear. "What we had is gone. It was not good enough, and it is gone, and we are not rebuilding it. If we build anything, we build something that has never existed, something with different terms." "Yes," He didn't hesitate. I know that. I need to stay at Langford. A beat. This property is mine. This work is mine. The farmers here, the school, the surveyor relationships. I am not walking away from what I have built here to return to being a presence in your household. Her voice was very firm. I am willing to consider what a shared life looks like. I am not willing for that life to be the one we had before. Helen. His voice was as steady as hers. I have spent 3 months watching you run this property, and I have spent those same 3 months going back to Hawthorne and seeing it with entirely different eyes. The way my tenants address me. The way my staff moves when I enter a room. The way I have organized my life around managing things and protected myself from actually knowing any of them. He held her gaze. I don't want the life we had before either. I didn't know that before December. I know it now. She looked at him carefully. What do you want? This, he said, simply, the word with the full weight of 3 months behind it. Whatever version of this you are willing to build, on your terms, in your timeline. I will arrange my estates to allow more time here. I will bring the Greaves and Carolina property management under proper agents, so I am not running between 4 counties. I will do whatever the practical arrangement requires. He paused. And I will not call it a sacrifice because it isn't one. Hawthorne Estate runs without me being present every day. It always did. I was present because presence felt like control, and control felt like safety, and I was not ready to examine what I was actually avoiding. He stopped, pressed forward. I was avoiding this, knowing another person, being known. The entrance hall was completely quiet. Helen looked at him for a long time. A full minute, perhaps the kind of minute that has weight. I need you to say one more thing, she said. He waited. Tell me what I cost you. Not what you lost, what I cost you. Because I have spent 5 years believing I was the only one who paid a price in our marriage, and I need to know if that's true. The question landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples spread outward, and he felt every one of them. He could have said something safe, something that acknowledged the pain without actually entering it. He recognized the escape routes available to him, because he was a man who had been using escape routes his entire life, and he chose deliberately not to take any of them. You cost me the truth about myself, he said. Every year I didn't see you, I was also not seeing myself. I believed I was a capable, functioning man, managing a life well. You leaving showed me that what I was managing was a performance, a very convincing one. He did not look away. I have spent 3 months meeting the person I actually am, not the person I managed estates, as not the person who sat at the head of dinner tables and conducted himself correctly, the actual person underneath all of it. And he is smaller and less certain and considerably less impressive than the one I had convinced myself I was. A pause. You cost me that comfortable lie. And I am. He stopped. The next word was the hardest word he had said in 3 months of hard words. Grateful. I am grateful. Because I was going to live inside that lie for the rest of my life if you hadn't walked out of it. Silence. Helen pressed her lips together. Once. The only crack. All right, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not try to make it so. All right, I am not saying it's fixed. She straightened. The composure came back, but differently now, not as a shield, as something more like a foundation. I am not saying I trust it completely. I am not saying the next year will be easy, or that there won't be times I look at you and feel everything that happened. Her eyes on his were very direct. But I am saying that I see what you have been building, and I am willing to build alongside it, carefully, honestly, without pretending the past did not happen. He crossed the entrance hall. He stopped directly in front of her, close but not reaching, still giving her the room that was hers to manage. Can I? He stopped, started again. May I? She understood. She took one step forward, and he put his arms around her, and she let him, and they stood in the entrance hall of Langford in the March evening, with 3 months of Thursdays, and 12 unread letters, and 40 miles of frozen road, and 1 sentence on a mahogany desk between them. And it was not a resolution. It was not the ending of a wound. It was something more honest and more durable than either of those things. It was 2 people choosing each other with full knowledge of the cost. The social world noticed as it always did, because the social world was constituted of people whose primary occupation was noticing. The story that circulated through the county gatherings and parlor visits of the spring season was told in various versions, ranging from the charitable to the considerably less so. The charitable version held that Lord and Lady Hawthorne had endured a period of difficulty, as many marriages did, and had worked through it with admirable discretion. The less charitable version, which Mrs. Hargreaves appeared to favor, was that Helen had staged a rather theatrical departure, and Joseph had been obliged to retrieve her, which spoke poorly of both of them in different directions. Mrs. Pryor, when this latter version reached her at a county gathering in April, straightened her considerable spine, and delivered a correction so thorough and so precisely calibrated to leave no room for further speculation that Mrs. Hargreaves was not heard to mention the Hawthorns again for the remainder of the season. Helen heard about this second-hand from Cecily's letter and told Joseph at supper on a Thursday. He listened. And then he laughed a real laugh, the uncurated kind, and she found that she was laughing too. And afterward, there was a moment in the kitchen where they looked at each other, and the laughing quieted into something else, something warmer and steadier. The way a fire settles after the initial combustion into something that will last. She had begun to recognize that particular quality of moment. The ones that didn't announce themselves, but would be, she suspected, the ones she carried longest. The question of Hawthorne Estate came to a head in April, in the way that complicated things always did, not with drama, but with paperwork. Joseph's lawyers needed decisions about the estate management structure. The Carolina property required attention that could not be entirely delegated, and the practical architecture of a life divided between two properties 40 miles apart needed to be formally addressed. He came to Helen with the documents. All of them. Spread them on the study table at Langford, and walked her through every decision point with the specificity and transparency of a man presenting a partnership arrangement to an equal. Not to a wife whose approval he was courting. To a person whose opinion he needed because it was sharper than his own in certain areas, and because these decisions affected her life as much as his. She worked through the documents with him, made 3 recommendations that required revisions, caught a legal exposure in the Carolina property transfer that neither Joseph's lawyers nor his agent had flagged, which she identified through a parallel in the Langford boundary precedent, and which saved him a dispute that would have taken 3 years and considerable expense to resolve. His lawyer, who had come down from Hawthorne to manage the signing, kept looking between Helen and Joseph with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation he thought he had already understood. "The Langford precedent reference," he said after the 4th revision Helen had caught. How did you? "I read the survey text twice, and the 1793 colonial ruling in full," Helen replied, moving on to the next document. The language in Section 4 of the Carolina Transfer mirrors the evidentiary framework in both. Joseph signing where she pointed without a flicker of the wounded pride that such deference from a landowner to his wife might once have produced in him, simply said, "She's right, revise it." The lawyer revised it. After he left, Helen sat back in her chair and looked at the signed documents and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not just satisfaction in the practical outcome, but something about what had just happened in that room. The fact that he had spread those papers in front of her. The fact that he had said, "She's right," without hesitation, and without theater, and without needing a moment to manage his own ego before agreeing. The fact that none of it had been performance. She had been watching very carefully for performance. The reflex of a woman who had learned that men who wanted to be forgiven were sometimes willing to perform growth without actually achieving it. She had been watching for the seams, the moments where the effort showed through and revealed itself as effort, rather than genuine change. The seams were getting harder to find. "Joseph," she said. He looked up from the final document. "In 5 years at Hawthorne, you never once asked me to look at a legal document." "No." He set down the pen. "I know." "Why did you bring these here?" He looked at her in the direct, undeflecting way he had learned or she had asked for, and he had provided. She was still not entirely certain which over the past 4 months. "Because you are the most rigorous thinker I have ever worked with," he said. "And because it is your life these documents govern as much as mine. And because I am done making decisions that affect you without you in the room." She held that. Those are three separate reasons, she said. Yes, all three are true. She looked down at the signed papers, then back up. I want to establish a formal arrangement, she said. Not for the social world, for us. Langford operates as my property, my management, my decisions, my accounts. I will consult you as I would any competent partner on matters where a second perspective strengthens the outcome. Hawthorne operates under whatever structure you determine, with my input sought and genuinely considered on matters that intersect our shared interests. She held his gaze. I am not asking to be Lady Hawthorne of Hawthorne Estate in the way I was before. I am asking to be Helen, who happens also to be your wife. He did not blink. Yes, he said. That is exactly what I want. Just like that. Just like that. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, and there was nothing in his face but the simple directness of a man who has thought something through completely. I spent 5 years assuming. I am done assuming. If you tell me what you need, I will tell you honestly whether I can provide it. That is a better system. Helen looked at him for a long moment. Cecily was right, she said almost to herself. About what? She said. She paused. She said that you were bearing it. The full weight of what you'd done. Not collapsing under it, not deflecting it. Bearing it. She looked at him steadily. She was right. I see you doing that. Every Thursday. Every Tuesday. Every time you sign where I point without making me explain why I'm right. You are usually right, he said. It would be inefficient to resist it. She laughed before she could decide not to. And he smiled, the real one, the one she had seen increasingly over 4 months, the one that had nothing managed in it. Stay tonight, she said. Not the guest room. The sitting room went very quiet. Joseph looked at her. His expression did not perform surprise or relief or triumph. It did something quieter and more genuine. It stilled in the way that deep water stills, and what she saw in it was a man who understood the weight of what she had just offered and was not going to diminish it by wanting it too loudly. Yes, he said, simply. That spring, the county saw something. It found genuinely puzzling. Lord Hawthorne appearing at Langford with the regularity of a man who lived there, and Lady Hawthorne appearing at Hawthorne Estate with the authority of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing in every room she entered. She restructured the Hawthorne tenant arrangements. Joseph had asked her to look at them because the Ferris dispute had revealed structural weaknesses in how the estate managed competing claims, and Helen had looked and seen with the eyes of someone who had spent 6 months running Langford exactly where the system was breaking down. She spent 3 weeks on it, still at Langford, still managing her own property, working on the Hawthorne revisions in the evenings, and produced an arrangement that Joseph's estate agent called the clearest boundary structure he'd seen in 20 years of property management. The agent said this to Joseph. Joseph said it to Helen. Helen said, "Tell him to send me any questions," in the voice of a woman who has stopped being surprised that her competence produces results. Mrs. Calloway, when Helen returned to Hawthorne in April for the first extended visit, received her in the entrance hall with the expression of a woman who has been hoping for a particular thing for 3 years and is being careful not to show how much. Helen hugged her. Properly, which was not done, and which Mrs. Calloway accepted with a rigidity that lasted approximately 2 seconds before she wrapped both arms around Lady Hawthorne and held on with the grip of a woman expressing everything she did not have language for. When they separated, Mrs. Calloway straightened her uniform with great dignity and said, "The east dining room is prepared, my lady. I've put fresh flowers." Helen looked at her. "You've been putting them there every morning, haven't you? Even when I wasn't here?" Mrs. Calloway met her eyes. "Every morning, my lady, since the day you left." Something crossed Helen's face, layered, complicated, the specific emotion of a woman. Understanding that she had been held in mind by people who loved her through everything she had not known they were witnessing. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway," she said quietly, "for all of it. Welcome home, my lady." Simple, certain. The words of a woman who meant every syllable. Helen did not correct the home. She let it stand. The thing that Cecily had asked about, the thing that the county gossip tried to summarize, and the lawyers tried to document, and the social world tried to categorize, was not possible to contain in any of those forms. Because what Joseph and Helen Hawthorne built in the year that followed was not a repaired marriage. It was not a reconciliation in the conventional sense. It was not the restoration of what had been broken. It was a marriage that had not existed before. Built from scratch on different ground with different terms, by two people who had both been changed by the destruction of the first one. Helen did not give up Langford. She never did. Langford remained hers, her work, her particular domain, the place where she had found herself, and which she was not going to surrender, because the finding had been too hard and too valuable. She split her time, and it was her split to manage, and Joseph never once suggested otherwise. Joseph learned to consult, not to defer to consult. There was a difference, and he learned it slowly and imperfectly, and sometimes got it wrong, and was told so, and adjusted. He learned that being told so was not the same as being diminished. He learned that a woman who trusted him enough to correct him directly was offering him something that the 5 years of careful silence had withheld, and that the correction was in its way the evidence of trust. He learned to see her, not perfectly, not without effort, but genuinely the way a person sees something they have decided matters to them, with attention and persistence, and the willingness to keep looking even when the looking was difficult. She learned to let him try. That was perhaps the harder of the two. She had become very good at not needing at building the wall between herself and hope, so that hope could not get back in and do what it had done before. Letting him try meant taking the wall down, brick by brick, Thursday by Thursday. And every time she took another brick down and nothing terrible happened, it became incrementally less likely that she would rebuild it. She did not stop watching. She was clear-eyed about that she was not a woman who would ever again take a person's presence as a given, not even his. She watched his choices. She tracked not what he said, but what he did in the mornings before anyone was observing. In the moments when doing the right thing cost something real. What she saw consistently was a man choosing differently than the man who had let the candles burn down to nothing, and that not the grand gesture, not the apology, not the 40 miles in the dark, was what finally convinced her. Not the drama of his return, the dailiness of his change. One evening at Langford, late in the summer of 1819, they were sitting on the small bench outside the kitchen door, where the evening air came across the fields warm and full of the season's end. Helen was reading. Joseph was reviewing correspondence, the sounds of the property settling around them. Ordinary, comfortable in the deep way that only comes from time. Helen set down her book. "I was wrong about one thing," she said. He looked up. "When I left, I told myself I was leaving because I had stopped waiting." She looked at the fields. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She turned to him. "I also left because I was afraid that if I stayed any longer, I would lose the last of myself entirely. The part that knew I deserved more, and I thought—" a pause. "I thought that part was incompatible with loving you. That I could have myself, or I could have the marriage, but not both." He set down the correspondence. "I was wrong," she said simply. "Not about leaving. Leaving was right, but about the incompatibility." He looked at her steadily, waiting the way she had taught him to wait, without filling the silence, without rushing to respond. "It turns out," she said, "that I can have both. This," she gestured at the space between them, meaning everything, all of it, Langford and Hawthorne and Thursdays and Tuesdays and the kitchen table, and the survey documents, and Mrs. Calloway's flowers, and 12 unread letters, and all the rest, "is not the marriage I had before. It is something that has room for me in it. And for you." She held his gaze. "And I did not believe that was possible. I want you to know that, because I want you to understand what it means that I believe it now." Joseph put down everything he was holding. He reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, not with the careful restraint of a man uncertain of permission, with the steadiness of a man who has earned the right to be steady. "I know what it means," he said. She looked at their joined hands, then at him. "Good," she said. The Virginia summer evening moved around them, unhurried, full of everything that a season in its fullness carries, and Helen Langford Hawthorne sat beside the man she had chosen, not out of hope, Not out of loneliness, not out of the old desperate wish to be seen, but out of the clearest, most hard-won knowledge of her own life. That love which survives the truth of itself, which does not flinch from what it cost, which is rebuilt on honest ground by two people who have both been changed by the breaking. That love is not the love of beginning. It is something rarer and stronger and worth every Thursday it took to build it. She had stopped waiting for Joseph Hawthorne the night she left. What she had found in the space that leaving made was a man worth returning to. And she had not returned because she needed him. She had returned because she chose him, and that difference, that single everything-changing difference, was the only foundation on which anything real had ever been or ever would